That night, while I was still making myself a cup of hot tea, my husband walked in and tossed a lottery slip onto the table, $33 million. But before I could even smile, he looked at me with those icy eyes and said I was nothing more than an old woman past her worth. Then he slid the divorce papers across the table, told me to get out of the very home I had kept together for 30 long years. I stood there in the yard, the door locking behind me, and I knew my battle started right there. But before we step into the rest of this story, go ahead and subscribe and tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. I can still remember, standing there in front of that locked door, the salt from the Miami sea drifting through my silver hair. That night the cold didn't come from the ocean breeze. It came from the words my husband had just thrown at me. 30 years of marriage, suddenly shattered into a handful of meaningless numbers on a Powerball jackpot ticket. But before I go on, I should tell you who I am, who he is, and how we ever got here. My name is Ilara Vance, 65 years old. For more than half my life, I was a promising interior architect, until, like so many women of my generation, I stepped back from my career to keep my family together. Harrison and I built that beachside home back when he had nothing but grit and big dreams. I designed every brick, every corner, every window that captured the late afternoon sunlight just the way we loved. And Harrison, well, he was always a man with fierce ambition. When we were young, that ambition kept us alive, but as the years went on, it twisted into arrogance, then control. I stayed beside him, trying to hold our peace together, telling myself that every family has its shadows. But the moment he won $33 million, those shadows peeled back. I never imagined that money wouldn't make a man happier, only reveal what he'd been hiding all along. Harrison came home like someone I barely recognized. He wasn't speaking softly anymore. His eyes were cold, his lips tight, like he was holding back pure contempt. And when I stepped forward to ask what was going on, he waved me off like brushing away a meaningless breeze and tossed the ticket onto the table. Moments later, those words, "an old woman past her worth," tore straight through the calm I had tried to wear for years. It wasn't just an insult. It was his way of saying that in his eyes my value had died long ago. And then, as if the whole thing had been planned in advance, Harrison opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the divorce papers. I recognized them instantly, our prenuptial agreement from 30 years back. I'd trusted him so completely then. I signed it without reading every line. Who thinks about splitting assets when you're young and building a life together? But Harrison wanted things clear. I thought it meant he was responsible. Turns out, clarity can be a weapon. The contract left me with a single payout, $500,000, even though our home and assets were worth many times that. I don't blame the young woman I once was for being naive, but I do resent the older woman who didn't notice the truth sooner. Sometimes a man's prudence isn't to protect his family, but to protect himself. And when I saw the signature of Harrison's daughter, Piper Vance, stamped onto the divorce papers as a witness, I understood that this betrayal didn't come from just one direction. Piper never saw me as her stepmother, but I never imagined she'd stand so firmly on his side, locking the door behind me as if I were a stranger trespassing on their porch. The door clicked shut. The lights inside dimmed. I stood on that porch listening to the waves, feeling something inside me grow quiet, and it wasn't despair. No, it was the opposite. You see, at this age people assume a woman's heart grows weaker, but sometimes it's shock that wakes up the strongest part of her. I stepped back, looked up at the home I'd built with my own hands, and realized loss can make the truth clearer than ever. And right there in the moment, everything was taken from me. I remembered something Harrison never expected me to have: the sharp memory of a woman who once signed that contract, and the calm, heavy patience of someone who has endured long enough to understand exactly where the power of the law lies. I turned away, walked down the steps, and knew without a single doubt my legal game began that night, and I wasn't going to let anyone else write the ending for me. I walked away from that mansion that night with nothing but a small suitcase and the faint smell of sea salt still clinging to my clothes. But what kept my back straight wasn't pride. It was the quiet, solid truth that I had nothing left to lose. And because of that, I could finally face a battle I'd never dared to confront before. The next morning, I went to see a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Julian Thorne, the very man Harrison once called his most dangerous rival in Miami's legal circles. When I stepped into his office, Julian looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen in men. No pity, no curiosity, just a careful assessment, as if he were measuring the strength of someone who'd just walked through fire. I told him everything, the insults, the old prenup, Piper's signature, the locked door shutting in my face. Julian listened without interrupting. And when I stopped, he set the file aside, folded his hands, and said something that shifted the entire direction of the war ahead. Mrs. Alara, that prenup isn't exactly on his side. At first I didn't understand. Then he opened his computer, pulled up a scanned copy of the agreement, and pointed to a tiny section I'd never noticed before, the Supplemental Marital Asset Addendum, the MSA. Harrison added it 5 years into our marriage, right when his career first took off. My hands trembled when I saw it. Not from fear, no, but because I remembered. I remembered the paperwork tied to mortgaging our first little house, the amendments, the signatures. I knew this document existed, and the MSA stated that if Harrison's net worth exceeded $15 million, he was required to share all assets gained afterward, 50-50. Yet for years, he told me his worth never crossed that threshold. That business was unstable. That investments tanked. That real estate values dropped. Turns out all those smooth explanations were nothing more than shadows meant to keep me blind. Julian tapped another file on his screen, Harrison's recent financial disclosures. I felt a chill run down my spine. He'd falsified records. He'd hidden assets. He'd even transferred portions under Piper's name to keep his net worth below the limit. Then Julian said something else, something that made my heart pound, like I'd just woken from a long sleep. The MSA includes a morality clause. If any of his relatives, including Piper, help conceal assets or emotionally coerce you, they lose all rights to the shared estate. I sat still, but inside the puzzle pieces began clicking into place. Piper hadn't just stood by her father. She'd been signing documents for him. I'd seen her accompany him to the bank more than once. I'd overheard late-night phone calls, her whispering nervous as if afraid I might catch a word. I didn't want to believe it. But truth has a way of pulling its own curtain open. Julian rested his hand on the file and looked at me with quiet confidence. Mrs. Alara, you don't just have the right to fight back, you have extraordinary legal leverage, and I trust you're calm enough to use it. I pressed my lips together. For the first time in years, I saw my real self reflected in the glass wall of that conference room, an older woman, yes, but with eyes still as sharp as when I drafted my most intricate designs. Harrison had chosen the wrong opponent. And so, we began. Julian filed a lawsuit in Florida court, accusing Harrison of intentional financial fraud, asset concealment, MSA violations, and emotional coercion. When the documents were sent, I stood beside Julian, watching the fax machine spit out each page, each sheet, a small, steady tap against the mask Harrison had worn for so many years. I thought I might shake when signing the complaint. But I didn't. I was calm, strangely calm. Calm in a way that felt destined. Calm as if 30 years of silence had finally found its voice. When the court accepted the filing, when the asset freeze was approved, I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt that justice had begun to take shape. But I had no idea that this single step would open another door, a door leading to a secret Harrison hid not only from me, but from the entire world. A secret so big, it wouldn't just shake our divorce trial, it would bring the FBI to his doorstep. And I, the woman thrown out of her home just days earlier, was about to walk straight into the storm Harrison thought he'd buried forever. What I didn't know was this time, he was the one stepping into the trap. I remember so clearly. Walking out of Julian's office that day, a thick stack of documents in my hand, stepping onto a Miami street still tinged with the salt of the sea. Everything suddenly felt different. In front of me wasn't the image of an old woman cast aside by her husband and his daughter, but a woman holding a legal weapon strong enough to turn her entire life around. The moment our divorce filings were submitted, the Florida court issued an immediate freeze on all marital assets, everything except the $33 million from the lottery, the very money Harrison and Piper thought they could snatch for themselves. When I got the news, I was standing in the yard, afternoon sunlight slipping through the leaves, but my heart wasn't warm. It felt like a current of purpose running through me. They thought I'd be weak, but I just turned that weakness into power. It didn't take Piper long to react. A few days later, she and her husband Troy showed up at my door wearing faces caught somewhere between pleading and overly confident. They offered me a deal, $2 million from the lottery if you drop the lawsuit. The way they looked at me, as if they were testing my limits, weighing what I had left. I smiled, not kindly. It was a smile full of clarity, containment, and a quiet strategy they never imagined I carried. I didn't answer them right away. Instead, I asked Julian for a small recording device and agreed to meet Piper and Troy again. We sat in the living room, soft yellow light spilling across the glass wall, illuminating every twitch on their faces. I listened carefully, every word, every breath, every little boast they thought I wouldn't catch. "We just want things to be easy, you know. No more fighting," Piper began. "Yeah, $2 million, you drop the case and everyone walks away happy," Troy added, trying to sound friendly but dripping with impatience. I nodded slowly, feeling my hand as light as if I were holding an invisible blade. I agreed, and every word out of their mouths was recorded. Every admission, every detail of the financial documents they'd signed for Harrison, every slip that tied them directly to the cover-up. When they left, I stood alone in the living room. The evidence in my hand didn't just strengthen the divorce case, it activated the penalty clause in our prenup. Piper would lose all rights to the marital estate. A wave of conflicted emotion rose in me, part satisfaction that justice was finally taking shape, part sorrow that the girl I once treated like my own grandchild had chosen to stand on the side of betrayal. But sorrow had no place in the battlefield I'd stepped into. Not anymore. If I wanted to win, I had to be faster, sharper, more decisive than ever. Every document, every witness, every detail had to be prepared. There was no room for mistakes. I'd once sacrificed my youth to protect that family. Now the very weight of my years, my experience, my patience had become my strongest weapon. In the weeks that followed, Harrison and Piper tried over and over to negotiate through my lawyer. But Julian and I held firm, no withdrawal, no compromise, no bribe. Every phone call, every letter from them tightened the tension like a string inside my chest. But it also awakened something powerful, a sense of authority I thought I had lost decades ago. And with every legal step, I saw more clearly how important observation and patience truly were. Piper thought I was easy to sway. Harrison thought I was fragile. Neither realized I'd reread every clause of that prenup from 30 years ago. Numbers and terms that once seemed meaningless now became strategic levers. One afternoon, as I sat in my study overlooking the ocean, my phone buzzed with a message from Julian. "We're about to have another twist, and this one will make Harrison panic." I didn't answer right away. I just smiled. When I walked into this legal war, I knew each step had to be deliberate, and I was now the one setting the tempo. From the outside, people might see me as a lonely old woman abandoned by her family. But inside these walls that had held my sacrifices and my heartbreak, I felt a different version of myself emerging, strong, calculating, unwilling to lose. Every move Harrison and Piper made, every attempt to outsmart me, now fell neatly into my line of sight, and I was ready to trap them with the very advantages they believed they had. Somewhere along the way, I realized something astonishing. Being thrown out of my home wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a power I never knew I'd possess. I wasn't just fighting for assets. I was proving that wisdom, patience, and righteousness can stand toe-to-toe with betrayal and manipulation, and win. The battle wasn't over. But from now on, every step Harrison and Piper took would be made with fear, and I was ready to turn this legal game into my complete victory. That afternoon, I could still smell the faint sweetness of my tea when Julian called me into his office to tell me Harrison had suddenly disappeared. At first, I thought it was just one of his tired little games, another way to dodge the divorce hearing. But something in me felt different this time. No confusion, just a coldness sliding through my chest, the kind you feel on a Miami night when the waves slam against the rocks without warning. Then my phone rang. A firm, steady voice spoke. "Mrs. Elara Vance, you need to listen to me. This is the FBI." I froze. The FBI. I had barely stepped into this messy legal battlefield, and suddenly I was being pulled into something far bigger than anything I had imagined. The agent told me something that left me breathless. Harrison wasn't the informant, and he wasn't the stalker they once suspected. He was the target of a massive international money laundering investigation. I remember the way my fingers trembled around that teacup, but my mind snapped sharp and clear. All those years he belittled me, pushed me out of the home I had held together. They weren't just the cruelties of a selfish man. Every lie, every hidden account, every fraudulent move he made was now under the glare of international law. The FBI told me that the $33 million Harrison won wasn't luck at all. It was a controlled delivery, one of those tricks criminal networks use to wash dirty money clean. And that was when I realized every legal move Julian and I had made, every freeze, every filing, every asset we dragged into the light had exposed a fracture in the system Harrison relied on. I stood there in the office, staring out the window, tasting both bitterness and a strange, quiet triumph. The divorce that was meant to break me had turned me into an unexpected ally of justice. Harrison's schemes, his arrogance, all of it was circling back to crush him. And I was no longer some helpless victim standing in the ruins. The hearing was supposed to happen in a few days, but Harrison had vanished. Julian explained that with everything we'd uncovered, his falsified documents, Piper's confession, the tangled financial records, the FBI now had enough evidence to bring down the entire network he was tied to. I sat there with my hand resting on the file torn in half. Part of me felt a dark satisfaction, knowing Harrison could no longer hurt me. But another part ached, realizing how enormous this had all become. Life isn't always what it seems from the surface. Sometimes the wounds that feel personal, the betrayals that cut the deepest, open the door to change the world around you. Harrison wasn't arrested right away. His disappearance lit a firestorm. News outlets, the FBI, international prosecutors, everyone had their eyes on the case. And I, Alara Vance, the woman he once called an old woman past her worth, now stood in the very center of it, unafraid. Every step I'd taken, freezing assets, recording Piper's confession, had turned into a strategic move shaping the final outcome. I wasn't gloating. I just finally understood the power I held. With the evidence, the prenup clauses, Julian's guidance, I had not only reclaimed what was mine, I had unintentionally helped dismantle an international laundering ring. I stood on my balcony, wind lifting the silver strands of my hair, and for the first time in years, I felt a new chapter opening. I reminded myself this victory isn't about money, or the mansion, or inheritance. It's proof that calm, intellect, and patience can flip the board, and that those who underestimate you eventually pay for their deceit. And as night settled over the water, I felt something I had never felt before: real power. Not the kind measured in bank accounts, but the kind born from turning betrayal into strength. Harrison may be running now, but justice will catch him soon. I'm not celebrating yet. I know the hardest part is still ahead, keeping control, dealing with Piper and Troy, preparing for the final hearing, so no one can ever twist the prenup, or twist me, again. For me, Alara Vance Harrison's betrayal and disappearance didn't break me. They placed me right at the center of the storm, and this time, I won't let anyone deceive me or threaten me ever again. When Harrison was finally arrested at a marina somewhere in Europe, I didn't cheer. I didn't even whisper a word. I just stood there in that quiet mansion, listening to the soft waves brushing the shore, feeling a silence so heavy yet so complete. All the anger, the wounds, the disappointments I had carried for 30 years, they dissolved at last, not through personal revenge, but through justice and truth. The $33 million he once waved around like a weapon was seized by the U.S. government, and I walked away with the beachfront estate and the remaining $10 million in marital assets, thanks to the supplemental property agreement and the court's ruling on divorce fraud. Piper and Troy, his loyal little shadows, lost their inheritance and now faced legal charges of their own. Their pain wasn't my joy. It was simply the price of greed and choosing the wrong side. The day I walked into court to sign the final judgment, I no longer felt like the Alara who'd been thrown out of her own home, not the old woman he insulted and abandoned. I was someone rebuilt from the ashes of hurt, steady, alert, and strong. My steps down that courthouse hall echoed like the rhythm of a woman who had lived through every shade of human emotion and learned that fairness doesn't come from luck, but from strategy, clarity, and courage. But my victory wasn't just about property or power. Somewhere along the way, the pain turned into purpose. I used my influence and the resources I fought for to create the Vance Legal Foundation, offering legal support to women and anyone harmed by abuse or fraud in marriage and divorce. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to make sure no one else suffered the way I did. One afternoon, standing on my balcony with the ocean stretching before me, I remembered the nights Harrison called me an old woman with no value, the night he locked me out of my own house, the sting of watching Piper take his side. And somehow, none of that hurt anymore. Instead, I felt a calm kind of power. Those tears, those moments of helplessness, they'd been replaced by trust in myself and in the strength of justice. I still recall Julian's words from the first day in his office before I even knew the MSA existed. You don't just have the right to fight back, you have an incredibly powerful legal lever. Back then, I didn't understand. But now, every decision I made, every step in that legal war, proved his point. Patience and clarity are the sharpest weapons a woman can wield. And then one day, I understood something deeper. Revenge isn't reclaiming money or power. Real revenge is changing the system so no one else gets crushed the way you were. I appeared before a state legislative committee speaking about the gaps in divorce law and prenups, sharing my story as living proof. And when I said revenge isn't getting the money back, revenge is changing the system so no one has to endure what I did, the entire room went silent. It was a silence filled with respect and recognition for everything I had survived and everything I had built. Sitting in my foundation office watching attorneys and volunteers preparing cases for people who needed help, I smiled. This was the real victory. Not just reclaiming what was mine, but creating something that would protect others from the pain I once carried. When night fell over the Miami shore and the breeze lifted the silver in my hair, my heart felt lighter than it had in decades. I had walked through betrayal, shock, heartbreak, and I was still standing. Stronger, kinder, sharper. A woman who finally understood that real power never comes from money or control, but from the ability to change the world around you through wisdom, resilience, and justice. 30 years of sacrifice, 30 years of silence, 30 years of endurance. All of it led me here to this moment where I am no longer a victim, no longer abandoned, but a woman who rebuilt her own life and opened a new chapter not just for herself, but for everyone she could help. And I know this is the greatest reward life has given me. My story ends here. Thank you for walking beside me, Alara Vance, through every emotional step of this journey. If my story moved you, inspired you, or left you wanting more family drama, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new episodes. Your support is what keeps these stories alive.